Good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll get started. I know grandchildren come second, so we'll give it another second. No, we have the real thing behind us.
That's your Bill. His name is Bill. You know?
Oh, yeah.
We all change. You look familiar.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Jim Swipe. I'm Vice President of the Sayville Historical Society. And we have a wonderful program today that will talk about our Homefront project. Myself, Roy Fetterlin, Chris Kurtz, and Stephanie DiChiera, okay, representing the library, the radio group, and our society. We've been meeting for a series of months on this project and how to keep history literally living through recording. And I'm going to pass it on to Chris, who will explain that further. And first off, I want to welcome and thank you all for coming on this cold afternoon. Thank you so much. Chris?
Thank you, Jim. Yeah, so just to recap, my name is Chris Kretz. I'm the president of the Long Island Radio and Television Historical Society. And actually starting last January, we formed a partnership with the Sayville Historical Society and the Sayville Public Library under the umbrella of the Long Island Homefront, which is an initiative to record memories of people growing up on the home front during the war. So we know there's been a lot of great projects recording veterans' histories and the veteran experience, but there was a realization that the stories of what it was like to grow up on the civilian side with the rationing and the shortages and all that kind of, those scenarios weren't being captured, and they're disappearing as much as the veteran stories. So we partnered together under, actually there's a national project, which is the website I'm showing you here, which is nationalhomefrontproject.org. It is Washington College in Maryland has the Starr Center for the Study of the American Experience. And they, similar to the Veterans Oral History Project, which you may have heard of, they're coordinating all over the country different groups collecting their regional stories and submitting a copy to them down in Washington College. So it's sort of a many-layered process, but we're the regional Long Island people, and we're trying to bring this out to more people now. We've done 10 interviews to date. 8 of them are on this webpage. Some of these people are in the room here with us today, so I want to thank, first of all, the people that are here. I think Rhoda McManus is here. Jack Beebe is here. And Marie Zanoni is here, if I've missed anyone. And the family of Marie Mack, who unfortunately passed away since we've interviewed her, but we thank all of you for contributing your time and your memories to this. And the goal is to have these archived here at the library and also down at Washington College so that researchers in the future can come and learn what it was like. Like we said, this living memory is fading fast. The people that will remember the radio shows and the food they were eating and even just what Long Island was like since the World War II boom has kind of eradicated a lot of the landscape of what Long Island was like. We're seeing a lot of glimpses in these interviews of what that pre-modern age Long Island was like. So what we're going to do today is introduce you to a lot of the people we've interviewed with some clips. We'll talk about some music. We have some other things to intersperse. We'll have some conversation. So we encourage anyone that has something to say from their own experience, their own stories they might have heard from their families. Just raise your hand and we'll have a discussion. And we're also going to leave it open if anyone wants to actually say something for a recording. We do these also for a podcast that we produce for the Radio Society. If anyone would like to come up and share a small snippet, we can do a recording here. It'd be like a little radio show, kind of harkening back to the NBC days. So again, a lot of different things. And we're going to start off, I'm going to play a first clip. It's going to be a series of snippets from our interviews, and if our audio holds. And we're going to start with, since we are the Radio and Television Historical Society, we're going to start with some clips on people's memories of radio. So one of the questions we ask as we do these oral histories is, what do you remember about radio? And for those of us, myself included, that grew up in the TV age, we can't quite grasp the importance of radio at that time. So let me just play you, and then we'll discuss.
Radio, oh my gosh, radio. Always listen to the radio. You sat by the radio at night, just like people sitting by and watch television.
I listened to the radio when I came home from school. I'd listen to Jack Armstrong, the All-American boy. He was one that was on a box of Wheaties. I still have one of the original broadcasts.
Breakfast Club was one that I didn't watch unless I was sick, because it was on in the morning.
And you had, everything was AM, because FM, I believe, was just coming out. But we had all AM radio. So, had WEAF, WJZ, WABC.
Lone Ranger, the Green Hornet, The Shadow.
And I remember I Love a Mystery, Jack Packard and Don Long. And there were a lot of mystery programs. It was very interesting.
And Uncle Don was another one. He always gave out birthdays, and I recall him. We listened especially one time because he announced my grandfather's birthday. Grandfather turned 80 or something.
You had the small radios, but the big radios were big consoles that were 4 or 5 foot high and had big speakers on the bottom. I mean, they were a piece of furniture.
There were only 3 buttons. One was dial, and the other was, on, off, and that was also loudness. And then there was another one that said shortwave. My father didn't let us touch that.
Little Orphan Annie, Captain Midnight.
And then also there was shows I used to listen to on Saturdays. Land of the Lost. It was about undersea water place in the South Pacific. And,
What did we listen to? Batman. A couple of those crazy detective type things,
Oh, there was Captain Midnight. Was one. He had a decoder ring you could send for, I think, with a couple of box tops from cereal, and he'd get home and he would always have a secret message. It'd be B3, D4, and then it might be some simple, be good to your mother or something.
Oh, there was a playhouse that was on at night, and the first play that I ever heard was called The Little Pest from Budapest. That stuck in my mind.
every Sunday, Sugar Biggie and Molly, the Jack Benny Show, I used to listen to all those comedies.
What music do you remember from the period? Does that bring you back?
Well, it was the beginning of I gotta say, Vaughn Monroe. Guy Lombardo lived in Freeport, just a few doors from us. He used to keep his boats at my father's yard.
And we listened to the musical programs at Firestone Theater and Music Till Midnight.
I know the radio was on the kitchen table, and it would be on, and we would hear the news reports, particularly. He was also a big fan of some of the jazz musicians. And since he taught in the high school, he had students who were very interested. One of my treasures as a child was a notebook that a student left at the end of the year And I don't know what was in it. That was discarded, I guess, but the whole cover of the notebook was covered with the names of big bands.
Well, my father loved classical music, so that was all that we had on the radio. So as we got older, we listened to the Make-Believe Ballroom. And Papa says, oh, that trash, why are you listening to it? His favorite singer was Marian Anderson.
Trying to think who it was now. There were a lot of characters on radio always fighting the bad people. So we were interested in listening to our children's soap operas on radio, but our parents always had the radio on to hear what was the news and so forth.
So how many of us is this in your memory? Does anyone have anything they would add to this lineup of memories listening to the radio? Ed, I know I've heard you talk about similar things, listening to the radio in your. So it's interesting when you do these oral histories. You never know. Each person has their own experience, so you never know what they're going to bring up. And so one family is all classical music, another is going to be jazz. Gabriel Heater, I don't know if that's a name anyone has heard before. He came up in a few interviews. He was sort of, I guess, the Walter Cronkite of his day. He was a newscaster. So for those of you that might remember these shows, we're going to do a little quiz. So if you know the answers, feel free to help your neighbors. Not all of us will be as up to date. So this is just a little quiz to get us interacting, trying to fill in the blank of the famous. This is all radio, so they would call it the theater of the mind. You wouldn't have a visual. You'd have to make the picture in your head. But they would start with an introduction. So there'd be famous introductions in music. So we're going to try to guess and fill in the blanks. So we'll start easily.
Oh, the shadow.
Okay, so who knows what evil lurks in where? Mind? Heart? I think it's hearts. In the hearts of hearts. Okay, so that was an easy one. Here's another one. Return with us now to those Golden. Yep. Yesteryear. What show is this from? And what's interesting, a lot of the early TV shows were radio shows brought to TV. So there was a Lone Ranger show on the radio first. Oh, this one's easy too. So again, Superman was a comic book, then he was a radio show, he was a movie serial, and then he became the 1950s show with George Reed. Fun fact, Jimmy Olsen and Perry White were characters introduced on the radio show, 9 Minutes. Now you know, in case anyone ever asks you. All right, this one's a little harder. My aunt listened to this. She was born in '34, and this was one of her favorites. So, it starts with a crowd noise at Grand Central Station. The crossroads of a million private lives, a gigantic, yes, there you go. Jack, do you remember this? I don't know what kind of stories they told. I guess it was more. This one I thought was interesting. Calling all adventure fans, calling all blank fans. Stand by, sirens in the background. Here comes blank now. So it's the same answer for both blanks. If you're a fan of adventure, you've got sirens. What kind of vehicles have sirens? All right, who's the most famous detective?
Dick Tracy.
There you go. Dick Tracy. This was a Dick Tracy radio show.
You did? I knew Dick Tracy.
Now this one I've never heard, but I've heard of it.
That's in the sanctum.
Right? It is in your sanctum. So the door would creak open. Sometimes they call it the creaking door show. Good evening, friends. This is your host. What was the name of the host of the Inner Sanctum? It was sort of a Twilight Zone horror show of its day.
Reading was always with.
It's sort of anticlimactic once you hear the answer. Jack, you want to guess? Raymond. Raymond, your host of the Inner Sanctum. some of these you can actually find online. There are clips of them still available. You can buy them on CDs a lot of times. Duffy's Tavern. Duffy's Tavern, where the elite meet to eat. Right, it would start with a guy in the phone, like they would call the tavern. So this was set in obviously Duffy's Tavern, sort of slice of life, maybe an Archie Bunker type show, I think. And then since we're the radio club, we also brought with us, and we were playing some music earlier, and if you have a chance to look before you leave, the radio that's on the table over there with John Volo, who's our radio expert. John, could you just tell us a little bit about the set you brought with us?
Okay. This particular radio is a Zenith Transoceanic. Zenith started making this radio in 1941 through 1960, the vacuum tube version. In 1970 and on, they made transistors. This particular one is 1944, so it falls into the World War II era. This radio can be run on batteries, but it's a giant battery. But this was very popular because you had 5 shortwave bands, plus AM. So you could listen to Radio Free Europe, you could listen to the BBC, you could listen to France, you could listen to Italy. I had this radio years ago when they were still broadcasting a lot of shortwave, and I would listen on a Saturday or a Sunday morning. I could pick up stations. They provided a logbook that would tell you what time and day what particular station would be on the air. And this has an antenna that pulls up, and you can connect a long wire to it and pick up these. But these were very popular overseas as well as here in the U.S. because they didn't need to be plugged into AC. There's a lot of these radios still floating around. They even made a military version, which is all green for the military.
So John, would they market that as portable?
They marketed this as a portable radio. You can call this the radio without the
Try to
battery
pick
is
it up
20
on your way
pounds.
out.
So you can call this the world's first boombox.
So another interesting aspect of this project, so we're talking to a lot of people, and as we find them, we get to them as soon as we can. And so we're getting a different range of ages, but they tend to fall into people that were children. And as you were listening, a lot of these shows that they were listening to, they were children listening to these shows. But as Jack, who was the last voice on the radio clip, was alluding to, their parents were listening to the news. And during the war, that's when radio really became the most important source of information. So I'm going to play you another medley of clips about how radio kind of came into prominence at that time.
I remember coming home from grade school, and my mother was listening to Gabriel Heder. Gabriel Heder at that time was a very known commentator. And she said, the Japanese just bombed Pearl Harbor. I said, where's Pearl Harbor? I was 13 years old then. And it was kind of shocking.
Every Sunday, we would go to my grandparents' house. My cousins lived across the street, so my 2 cousins and my grand aunt and uncle, myself, my brother, and my parents would drive down to Brooklyn, Himrod Street, and go to my grandparents for Sunday dinner. Well, usually Sunday after dinner, parents would be inside talking, and I would go into the living room because I like to listen to The Shadow on the radio. The Shadow was on at 5 p.m. at night. And while The Shadow was talking, or they're talking about the show, or something was going on about it, they interrupted the newscast and telling us the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Well, I didn't know too much about the Japanese or Pearl Harbor, so I went and told the parents, and well, everybody was all upset. And then I realized it was a major problem, but I didn't realize how much until I got older.
My Aunt Janet Steers had the radio on, and she screamed from the backyard, Rosie, put the radio on, something happened, and it was Pearl Harbor, the bombing of Pearl Harbor.
My father had on a football game. I'm not quite sure who was playing, but they interrupted to say that we had been attacked at Pearl Harbor, and then President Roosevelt got on and gave his famous infantry This day will go down in infamy speech.
And I remember coming back from slave riding, and something was on the radio, and I was making a lot of noise and so forth, and Mom and Dad were angry that I was disturbing, that they had to hear some news and so forth. So I feel that was probably because it was just something as a child that bothered me, and I thought about later, but I'm thinking that was probably when I heard about Pearl Harbor. I mean, it was December, so it would be sleigh riding, so that would be logical.
I was probably 12 years old, and it was a Sunday, and I was down at my father's boatyard, and I was making myself some decoys, duck decoys. And it was maybe 3:30 in the afternoon or so. My father's brother came down, and he used to always call me Fritz. They had to forget about Fritz when the Germans got involved.
So you're making decoys when
I was
you
making
heard.
decoys, and my uncle came down and he said, "We are in trouble." That was his words.
So is anyone in this room still have some memories of that too? It's interesting because there's a parallel with, the 9/11, where you remember 9/11, and if I were to try to think back, I would have to strain my memory. But anyone else here who would like to mention anything, or what you've heard from your parents or anything like that?
My parents' wedding day.
Oh, was it?
They
Okay.
just came out of church and got into the limo, and the limo driver said, "Your kids got into a mess." And she thought he was just being a wisecracker. And he said, "Did you have spawn Pearl Harbor?" And my mother goes, "What's Pearl Harbor?" She had no clue. And they had to cancel all leaves and stay in Manhattan. And
Was he in the military?
he was going to be, so they had to stay local. Yeah. So, yeah, it was scary times, I'm sure.
Yeah, and that comes out. And there are actually some man on the street interviews that they did on the radio at the time, so interviewing people in the moment of what they thought of Pearl Harbor too. So there's a lot of information to sort of build around the memories that we're collecting here. And it's always interesting to see, the different scenarios. So some people are with their family, some are, the man making the decoys is Fred Skopinich, who owned his uncle and brother and father owned a boatyard in Freeport. That's why I mentioned Freeport and knowing Guy Lombardo and the others. And if we have time, I'll play some clips, because his boatyard, his father and uncle built ships in the 1920s for the Coast Guard, and then they would build them a little faster for the rum runners, who would pay them a little extra. So they had a good job going. And then the Navy came and they wanted some craft themselves, so they actually designed some landing crafts and some rescue crafts that were actually in use in the Navy in the war. So it's, again, these little pieces of their local history, their Long Island history, but they also have a national importance. And we're going to get into aviation now, and we can all probably imagine the importance, just talking about Drummond and the Republic and all the different places we might know about Long Island's aviation past. So something that comes up often in these interviews too is planes and aviation. So I'm going to play you some things, and then we'll talk about them as well.
We did have people who were supposed to keep spotting. We had air raid wardens, plane spotters, coast watches, all that kind of stuff. And then the whistle would blow and you had to pull your cars off the side of the road, I remember that. Wait till the whistle blew again. And at home you couldn't be out in the yard when that went off. I think you had to pull down the shades even in the daylight. What kind of weird stuff like that?
The siren would sound, and it was an air raid, and or it was a practice air raid. You had to be alert to it. It was a practice. If you heard this in real time, you would do the same thing. So it was to get everybody used to the fact that you might have enemy planes flying over, and you blacked out your area. And it was like a double shade. The regular shade, there was a dark shade that actually pulled down to make a double face on the window. So if the air raid siren sounded, you had to pull down those shades. And I'm not gonna mention any names, but it was a relative of my father's, was an air raid warden, and of course, this was a very, very important job. And it came with great authority, because it was the federal war effort, and his word was whatever he decided it should be to make this a proper way of behaving for the, the issue, whatever it was. One night, my mother was just upset so badly that door knock came after the air raid siren, and what could that be? And it was Uncle so-and-so saying, "You've got to cover up that window, I can see a crack of light coming out." And it was just an awful thing. But I remember that. My mother was, we thought it was funny, but my mother did not think it was funny.
I remember my mom and dad, the orders from the area warden, they close the shades, don't light at a certain time, the little children, turn your sofas upside down and put the little ones under there. And we did it. Because, your mother said you got to get under there, you got under there and followed the rules. They were so efficient, the air raid wardens. If we needed anything, what we should, we had to keep the first aid kits filled with everything that was necessary. You had places in emergency where to go to, and there weren't too many places, but you had the church, the school.
In school, why, we had a couple air raid drills, and I recall them assigning houses to everyone, so that when there was an air raid, why, we'd go to these different houses that were in the vicinity of the school, and the younger kids were assigned within, as we call them, younger kids and older kids. It was probably 4 or 5 would go to different houses. So later on, when they had the hydrogen bomb scares and what have you, this was way later on, why to go 5 or 6 houses away from the school wouldn't have been any help. But I can recall us going down to a house that was probably 10 or 15 houses down from the school.
And this was to check on them, or to stay with them, or what was the purpose of?
No, it was for us to stay with them.
Okay.
We were assigned, we were kids, and of course, somebody had to be there to watch us. So.
I was in an elementary school about 2 blocks from my home. Came home for lunch every day. But I do remember when the air raids happened, and they did happen. I can't tell you how frequently, but I remember sitting in the halls and singing songs. And it happened enough that it's still in my memory today.
And during the war, every once in a while we had air raid sirens. Sometimes we had to hide under our desks. Other times we had to go down to the basement area. And other times we had to go home, and then they'd lead us to the corner. And then we generally go home by ourselves, but not too much. Most of the time it was in place, the air raids. But it was very prevalent.
Yes, I had a block to patrol, air raid drill. I had my helmet, my flashlight, and I patrolled the block. And if you saw any lights on in any house, you had to go up to the doorbell, ring the doorbell and say, "Please put your lights out." It was a complete blackout. They used to have drills, blackout drills.
How often would they do that?
I don't remember anymore, but there were several. There were several. You knew when no one was coming, because then the sirens would go off.
Mm-hmm. And what was Brooklyn like when there was a blackout?
Quiet. It was really very eerie quiet. You could hear the what do you call it on the ship? The whistles blowing.
From the ships out in the
in the Hudson River,
mm-hmm.
in the city, you could hear that, just that sound.
and I remember that was Marie Mack, the last clip there, and I remember she was saying she wished she still had the helmet, right?
Yeah.
That's the one thing she didn't keep. Anything if you would care to share about your mother's memories that you might have mentioned or talked about?
You know, she had so many memories. She was amazing. She was, you know, we tried to tell her a few years ago, we'd just like to put a tape recorder in front of you and, you know, just listen to all your stories, and she never would. And about 6 months before she passed away, she goes, why don't you guys ever put a recorder in front of me?
Right.
Because everybody, she had just turned 100, so everybody was asking her all of these questions,
And it's amazing, again, the living memory. So what I always remember from her interview is she says, so her husband was stationed in Australia.
Yes.
He was an MP.
Yeah.
And when he came back from the war, the first night, he went out drinking with his father-in-law because his father-in-law had served in the Spanish-American War.
Yeah.
And they kind of traded stories of the different wars, you know, one from 1896 or whatever that was,
Yeah.
the other from 1940 something. So it's amazing, once you start asking these people questions, they start connecting it to an earlier age, to their
Yeah.
parents and beyond, so you really get some deep, interesting connection.
Yeah. He also had he brought home a gift for my mother and for my older sister, and it was 2 grass skirts made out of his parachute. So,
And I'm finding it, and this varies too, but it seems a lot of people saved a lot of things.
yeah.
So I don't know, those of you with older parents, maybe from the 40s, do you have basements full of artifacts or a lot of?
Yeah.
At some point, you know, it becomes a mission of what do you do with it. But you see some of these pictures, we ask if anyone has anything that would help tell the story. That's why they're holding up these things in front of them in these pictures. And we record a lot of them in the library here, up in the conference room, but we do go to people's houses, so if it's easier for them, we go wherever it's easier. This is the equipment we use, so any kitchen table or out-of-the-way place we can set up in. So I'm going to play one more set of clips, and then we'll take a little break. There is some coffee and some cookies back there. But since we're talking about aviation, to kind of continue on that theme, so we're talking a little bit about the air raid warnings, which is a common theme with everybody. This one.
Yeah, well, at Mitchell Field, during 41, 42, they had squadrons of airplanes coming in, P-39s, P-40s. I remember the P-40s, they were painted with a sand type of a finish, I guess used for that desert warfare. I saw those P-40s, a P-39. I saw a P-39 right over my head. I was the stream beam. And smoke started to trail from it. The pilot rolled on his back and he bailed out. I guess he had some sort of engine failure and cracked up in Uniondale. The excitement was so intense there. It was just amazing.
I started at PS 33 in Queens Village. One morning on the way to school, which is in 1942, I guess, 43, I don't remember, yeah, it had to be 42, because I transferred to another school after that. And my father had been taking me to school, which wasn't always so. And on the way to school, we saw 2 planes in the air. And we didn't know if they were military or not. And we saw them collide. So rather than stop and drop me off at school, my father drove over to where the planes crashed, which was only about 6 blocks away. But by that time, they had demolished the houses and everything was broken in fire, and the firemen had just come. But my father retrieved a piece from the fire and from one of the planes. But I had it for years, but I don't know whatever happened to it.
We had little playing cards that were like trading cards, baseball cards, and so forth and so on. And they had silhouettes of planes, and we had the silhouettes of the American planes. And of course, being here on Long Island with Republic and Grumman, we had planes flying over here all the time. And So we would have the P-38 Thunderbolt. Oh, there goes one. We could take our cards out and say, wow, look at that plane. Do you see the silhouette, what it's like? But we also had silhouettes of enemy planes. Now, we as children must have believed that there were enemy planes going to be flying over, as our parents did. Now you think back and say, well, what kind of radar systems? Whether radar really didn't come in, and sonar and stuff didn't come in until the wartime was on, and also at the beginning, I think we weren't afraid as children, but it was very serious. That if Dad had to go stand in the old 88 ceiling tower and look for enemy planes, that's what they did at night, and I don't know, I guess we really thought we might see, now we never occurred to us that these planes might bring us harm, but we might see a Japanese Zero plane fly over it, because here's the silhouette if we see, and of course, a lot of planes looked alike way up there in the sky, so we probably would have misinterpreted what we were seeing, but these are things that we did.
Everybody went, they had classes, and you got a pack of cards with silhouettes of planes so that you could spot a plane by its silhouette. And although we were too young to serve, when my cousin and I got very interested in it, and they'd give tests, and he and I would both ace it because we were so interested, and the older people hadn't probably looked at their cards at all.
Planes, that was, because we were near Mitchell Field, we were near Republic Aviation, because in Queens, so a lot of planes flying overhead, and that's one of my fun things to do, was I got books on plane spotting, and I used to spot the planes as they went overhead and mark them down, which ones I have seen. So that was another thing during the war.
Was there, we've talked to a few people that had stamp books where they would try to identify planes. Were you doing things like that, or could you tell from the planes which types were going off?
I can tell what type of airplane by listening to the engine. Some of the people on the street said, well, what kind of airplane is this? That's a B-25, because a B-25 had individual exhaust stacks, and you could hear pop, 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 pop. And some of these engines, the collectors, they had a smoother running engine. I could tell what kind of airplane it was, because I built the models, and I got all the aviation magazines. I thumbed through everything. Every magazine I could possibly get a hold of.
Now, I was going to ask, I started to ask this as the interviews went on. This is for Rhoda and Marie, if you have any thoughts. But as the women that we interviewed, it doesn't come up with the women. Was this more, would you say, a gender thing? Like the boys were more into planes and spotting the planes, or were you as interested in, do you recall being interested in plane spotting and types?
No, not at all.
So maybe there's some gender differences. But it did pique my interest as to all these stories about crashes and things. I'm just going to show you quickly some, if I can find the headlines. These are all from the Suffolk County News. And it is surprising once you start looking the amount of plane crashes. And again, these are military planes, so these are test pilots, people training for the war. So these are just sort of walking through some things. May 8th, this was a plane that was salvaged from Fire Island Inlet. May 15th, 2 planes forced down in Browns Creek, and they had to stay the night until they could get up again. This is in 42 again, a crash at a house in Islip. This is a crash in Huntington. Another one over Islip. Ship hit a freight boat. Here's over Mauritius Inlet. This is a burning plane landed in a cornfield. This is interesting. So this is, I know it's hard to see, but we're talking about plane spotting and towers. So there's actually, they built observation towers. And I think Jackie mentioned the site we're on was Old 88. And there was a tower in that building.
When you went to the town with your grandfather.
Did you?
Yeah, back with my grandfather.
In Sayville?
No, I was in Yaphank.
Oh, in Yaphank, okay. And what this is from the Suffolk County News, so this is the schedule of watchers manning the observation post in Sayville in old 88. What's interesting is that women did it from 8 to 8 in the morning, they didn't do the night shift, they did 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. High school girls could be on that shift with other women, and then the men would do the overnights from 8 to 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. And one interesting side note, and Jim, if you're ready, there's a gentleman named Paul Bailey, was an old newspaperman on the island. He was also a poet and became sort of a poet laureate of Long Island, published some books. He founded the Long Island Forum, that anyone remembers that magazine? It was a Long Island History magazine, but he has a poem about this exact thing, and Jim from the Sayville Historical Society is going to give us a recitation.
So we're not much past Valentine's Day, and this is actually a very touching story called Spotting in the Dark. There was a man so old and dried, when the war broke out, he was classified as being the same as excess freight, born too soon and living too late. But though decrepit and quite rheumatic, he still had brains in his bald old attic. He could hear a bit and could see the sky, and he had that spirit to do or die. So thrice a week, at an early hour, he climbed to the observation tower and did his bit with a nice old maid who knew his age and wasn't afraid. They grew quite chummy as time went by, night after night, 'neath the starry sky. For planes were scarce from 12 to 2. There wasn't a hell of a lot to do. She called him Mr. when first they met, but soon it was Tom, and he called her Et. And on the school, in the moonlight's gleam, the devil began to turn on steam. When they got to snuggling against the cold, Tom discovered he wasn't so old. And Etta, as pure as the morning dew, started getting some ideas too. 2 lonely souls in a little tower with nothing to do, and at such an hour. But who was to say how far they got, or even whether they did or not? We can only guess at what took place, a friendly kiss or a fond embrace. But no matter what the gossips said, knowing the sort of lives they led, no enemy plane nor enemy bomb could have spoiled the moment for Et and Tom. As the village slumbered, and they, forsooth, forgot their age on the schoolhouse roof. The moral? You're never too old to learn. Just go to school with a normal yearn. They're married now, and they're doing well, and you can't tell them that war is hell.
So again, that's sort of just an encapsulation of the whole crane spotting thing. We have an interview with Fred Skopernich about a tower they built on Jones Beach. It was about, I think, 200 feet high or so. And they snuck in after school and climbed it, and by the time they got to the top, they were so scared they couldn't come down. So again, we are on the coast here, obviously. We'll talk a little more after the break about submarines, and there was a real danger, and so, we can look back on it now and say, well, of course, the Japanese weren't going to attack the East Coast, or the Germans couldn't get that far. But at the time, we didn't know, right? So it was always a precaution, just in case. So take a break. There's some coffee, some cookies. Walk around. There's some great material from the time period, Life magazine, some photographs and postcards, and talk amongst yourselves, or if you want to know more about the project before we start up again in about 10 minutes, we'll all be here.